The Bombing of Darwin, also known as the Battle of Darwin, on 19 February 1942 was both the first and the largest single attack ever mounted by a foreign power on Australia. On that day, 242 Japanese aircraft attacked ships in Darwin's harbour and the town's two airfields in an attempt to prevent the Allies from using them as bases to contest the invasions of Timor and Java. The town was only lightly defended and the Japanese inflicted heavy losses upon the Allied forces at little cost to themselves. The urban areas of Darwin also suffered some damage from the raids and there were a number of civilian casualties. The raids were the first and largest of almost 100 air raids against Australia during 1942–43. Background: in 1942, Darwin was a small town with limited civil and military infrastructure. Due to its strategic position in northern Australia, the Royal Australian Navy and Royal Australian Air Force had constructed bases near the town in the 1930s and the early years of World War II. Darwin's pre-war population was 5,800. As early as August 1941, Darwin had been a key in the South Pacific air ferry route designed to avoid routes through the Japanese Mandate in the Central Pacific for bomber reinforcement of the Philippines. The first flight to use the route occurred when 9 B-17D bombers of the 14th Bombardment Squadron left Hawaii on 5 September and passed through Darwin 10 to 12 September. By October 1941, plans were underway to position fuel and supplies with two ships, including USAT Don Esteban, being chartered and actively engaged in that purpose when war came. By November 1941, Australia had agreed to allow the establishment of training bases, maintenance facilities, munitions storage, communications, and improvement of airfields, including at Darwin, to meet the needs of the B-17 bombers in Australia. Following the outbreak of the Pacific War in early December 1941, Darwin's defences were strengthened, in line with plans developed before the war. Several Australian Army and RAF units stationed in the town were sent to the Dutch East Indies to strengthen the defences of the islands of Ambon and Timor. The improvised plan for support of the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies that was completed in Washington on 20 December 1941 by the U.S. Army General Staff envisioned Darwin as the hub of transshipment efforts to supply those forces by landing supplies at Brisbane, overland shipment to Darwin, and then onward by air and blockade-running ships. The reality was transport to Darwin by sea was necessary and thus supplies and shipping intended both to build a Darwin base and to support both. The Java and Philippine forces were gathered in Darwin and the vicinity. In the 2 months before the air raids, all but 2,000 civilians were evacuated from the town. Japanese submarines I-121 and I-123 laid mines off Darwin in January 1942. By mid-February 1942, Darwin had become an important Allied base for the defense of the DEI. The Japanese had captured Ambon, Borneo, and Celebes between December 1941 and early February 1942. Landings on Timor were scheduled for the 20th of February, and an invasion of Java was planned to take place shortly afterwards. In order to protect these landings from Allied interference, the Japanese military command decided to conduct a major air raid on Darwin. On 10 February, a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft overflew the town, and identified an aircraft carrier, 5 destroyers, and 21 merchant ships in Darwin Harbour, as well as 30 aircraft at the town's 2 airfields. Among the ships in harbour were those returned the morning before the attack from the convoy escorted by US Houston, involved in the failed effort to reinforce Timor. Houston had departed for Java but left Mauna Loa and the Megs, which had attempted to transport Australian troops to Timor, and the U.S. Army transports Port Ma and Tulungi, which had embarked a U.S. infantry regiment at Darwin. Prelude. Opposing forces. Despite Darwin's strategic importance to the defense of Australia, the city was poorly defended. The Australian Army's anti-aircraft defences comprised 16 QF 3.7-inch AA guns and 2 3-inch AA guns to counter aircraft flying at high altitude, and a small number of Lewis guns for use against low-flying raiders. The crews of these guns had conducted little recent training due to ammunition shortages. The air forces stationed in and near the town comprised No. 12 Squadron, which was equipped with Catquirraway advanced trainers, and No. 13 Squadron, which operated Lockheed Hudson light bombers. 6 Hudsons, 3 from No. 2 Squadron and 3 from No. 13 Squadron also arrived at Darwin on the 19th of February after having been evacuated from Timor. None of the 6 Wirraways at Darwin on the day of the raid were serviceable. At the time of the event, there were no radars functioning to provide early warning of air raids, and the town's civil defences were dysfunctional. The Low Commission, which was appointed to investigate the raids shortly after they occurred, was informed that the Australian military estimated that Darwin would have needed 36 heavy anti-aircraft guns and 250 fighter aircraft to defend it against a raid of the scale which occurred on the 19th of February. In addition to the Australian forces, 10 United States Army Air Force's Curtiss P-40 Warhawks were passing through Darwin en route to Java on the day of the attack. The P-40 pilots had little experience with these aircraft and had not previously seen combat. A total of 45 Allied warships and merchant vessels were in Darwin Harbour at the time of the raids. The warships included the United States Navy destroyer Perry and seaplane tender William B. Preston. The roundships in port were the sloops Swan and Warrego, corvettes Deloraine and Katoomba, auxiliary minesweepers Gunbar and Tolga, patrol boat Kangula, depot ship Platypus, examination vessel Southern Cross, lugger Mavie, and 4 boom net ships. Several USN and Australian troop ships were in the harbour along with a number of merchant vessels of varying sizes. Most of the ships in the harbour were anchored near each other, making them an easy target for air attack. Moreover, no plans had been prepared for how the ships should respond to an air raid. In addition to the vessels in port, the American Army supply ships Don Isidro and Florence D. Philippine vessels acquired as part of the Southwest Pacific Area Command's Permanent Army Fleet earlier in February, were near Bathurst Island bound for the Philippines on the morning of the raid. Darwin was attacked by aircraft flying from aircraft carriers and land bases in the DEI. The main force involved in the raid was the 1st Carrier Air Fleet, which was commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumu. This force comprised the aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soru and a powerful force of escorting surface ships. All 4 carriers had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor at the start of the Pacific War. In addition to the carrier-based aircraft, 54 land-based bombers also struck Darwin. These comprised 27 G-3M Nell bombers flying from Ambon and another 27 G-4M Betty bombers operating from Kendari and Celebes. Allied warships and merchant vessels in Darwin Harbour at time of raid table based on AWM 78. 400 Halves Darwin Naval Base. Reports of proceedings, War Diary, air raids. First raid. The 4 Japanese aircraft carriers launched 188 aircraft during the morning of the 19th of February. These comprised 36 A-6M0 fighters, 71 D-3A Val dive bombers, and 81 B-5N Kate torpedo bombers. All the aircraft were launched by 8:45 a.m. This raiding force was led by Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, who had also commanded the first wave of attackers during the raid on Pearl Harbor. The carrier aircraft had the objective of attacking the ships in Darwin Harbor as well as the town's port facilities. On their way to Darwin, Zeros shot down a U.S. Navy PBY Catalina and strafed a USAAC C-47 Skytrain on the ground, near Melville Island. At 9:35 a.m. Father McGrath of the Sacred Heart Mission on Bathurst Island, who was also an Australian coast watcher, sent a message using a pedal radio to the Amalgamated Wireless Postal Radio Station at Darwin that a large number of aircraft were flying overhead and proceeding southward. The message was then relayed to the Royal Australian Air Force Operations at 9:37 a.m. No general alarm was given until about 10 a.m. as the RAF officers there wrongly judged that the aircraft which had been sighted were the 10 USAAC P-40s, which were returning to Darwin at the time after reports of bad weather forced them to abort a flight to Java via Kupang, West Timor. As a result, the air raid sirens at Darwin were not sounded before the raid. The Japanese raiders began to arrive over Darwin at 9:58 a.m. HMAS Gunbar was the first ship to be attacked, being strafed by 90 fighters. At about this time, the town's air raid sirens were belatedly sounded. The Japanese bombers then conducted dive bombing and level bombing attacks on the ships in Darwin Harbour. These attacks lasted for 40 minutes, and resulted in the sinking of 3 warships and 5 merchant vessels and damage to another 10 ships. The ships sunk were the US Perry, HMAS Mavie, USAT Megs, MV Neptuna, Zealandia, SS Mauna Low, MV British Motorist, and the coal storage hulk Kelat. At least 21 laborers working on the wharf were killed when it was bombed. In addition to the raid on the harbour, other Japanese naval aircraft bombed the RAF base and civil airfield in Darwin as well as the town's army barracks and oil store. All of these facilities were seriously damaged. The Allied air defences at Darwin shot down 1 Japanese aircraft. Another crashed at Melville Island, and 2 others crash-landed upon returning to the carriers. The first wave of Japanese planes left the Darwin area at about 10:40 a.m. On their way back to the carriers they passed over the Florence D. and Don Isidro. Second raid. The second wave of 27 G3M and 27 G4M land-based bombers arrived over Darwin just before midday. The town's air raid sirens were sounded at 11:58 a.m. when the bombers were sighted. The Japanese force separated into 2 groups flying at 18,000 feet. One of these formations attacked RAF base Darwin from the southwest while the other approached from the northeast. The 2 formations arrived over the base at the same time, and dropped their bombs simultaneously. The Japanese bombers then turned, and made a second attack on the base. Due to defective fuses, the Australian heavy anti-aircraft gunners were unable to damage the high-flying Japanese aircraft. The bombers left the Darwin area at about 12:20 p.m. This raid inflicted extensive damage on the RAF base, though casualties were light. Of the RAF aircraft at the base, 6 Hudson light bombers were destroyed and another Hudson and a Wirraway were badly damaged. 2 American P-40s and a B-24 Liberator bomber were also destroyed. 6 RAF personnel were killed. The Japanese carrier force launched a small number of D-3A dive bombers during the afternoon of the 19th of February to attack the Florence D. and Don Isidro. Don Isidro was the first of these 2 ships to be attacked, and was rapidly sunk 40 kilometers north of Melville Island. 11 of her 84-strong crew were killed. The dive bombers also attacked Florence D. and sank her off Bathurst Island with the loss of 4 crewmen. All of the survivors from Don Isidro were rescued by the corvette HMAS Warrnambool on the 20th of February. Some of Florence D.'s survivors landed on Bathurst and Melville Islands, while the remainder were rescued by Warrnambool on the 23rd of February. Among the survivors of Florence D. were the rescued crew of a U.S. Navy PBY piloted by then Lt. Thomas H. Moore, who was later to become chairman of the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff. Admiral Halstead, strafed and with plates damaged by near misses, was brought to the pier where U.S. Army volunteers along with survivors of the U.S. and Philippine vessels helped unload her 14,000 drums of aviation gasoline.